The paper hit Wallace Rourke's desk like a slap across the face. It landed with a sharp crack against the worn oak surface, skidding past his coffee tin and stopping just short of the edge, and the man who had thrown it, a slick, well-dressed agent named Darby Crane from the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe, stood on the other side of that desk with his arms folded and his chin lifted like he had already won something. Wallace did not move. He sat back in his chair, one boot crossed over his knee, his dark eyes reading the document without touching it. The office around him smelled of tobacco and dust, and the faint iron edge of the dry New Mexico wind blowing through the cracked window behind him. Outside, the town of Hartwell was alive with the ordinary sounds of a Wednesday afternoon in the spring of 1882. Horses at the rail, a woman calling to her child, the slow creak of the general store's sign swinging in the breeze. None of that ordinary sound reached Wallace Rourke right now. He was reading. When he finished, he looked up. "No," he said. Darby Crane blinked. "I beg your pardon. No." Wallace pushed the paper back across the desk with one finger, a single slow movement until it hung off the edge and fell to the floor between them. "I will not file that eviction order. Bring me an honest order or get off my porch." The color that flooded Darby Crane's face was remarkable, a deep, wine-dark crimson that climbed from his collar to his hat brim in roughly 3 seconds. "Sheriff Rourke, this document bears the seal of the Territorial Land Commissioner himself. The woman residing on the Brenner homestead at the North Fork of the Cimarron Creek has no legal standing." "The deed was transferred." "The deed," Wallace said, standing now, his full height filling the space between them, "was not transferred legally. And you know that as well as I do. I have seen the original filing. That homestead was registered to James Brenner in 1874, and his widow has every right under territorial law to remain on that land until a court of proper jurisdiction rules otherwise." He picked up his hat from the peg beside the door and settled it on his head. "Which means a real judge, not a land commissioner who happens to be on the payroll of the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company." The silence that followed was the kind that had weight to it. Darby Crane picked up the paper from the floor, folded it precisely, and slid it back into his coat pocket. When he looked at Wallace again, the crimson had drained away and something colder had replaced it. "You are making a very serious mistake, Sheriff." "I make them regularly," Wallace said, opening the door. "Now I asked you to get off my porch. I was being polite. I am asking you one more time before I stop being polite." The agent left. Wallace watched him go from the doorway, watched him climb up onto his rented horse and ride back down the main street of Hartwell toward the telegraph office. Because of course he was heading to the telegraph office. And Wallace stood there in the afternoon sun thinking about Florence Brenner, who he had only met 3 times in his life, and who had no idea that the most powerful cattle company in New Mexico territory had just decided to make her disappear. He thought about how that needed to change. He thought about it very seriously, and then he pulled the door shut behind him, told his deputy Tom Aldrich to hold the office, saddled his horse, and rode north toward the Cimarron. It had started 6 weeks earlier, not with Florence Brenner and not with the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company. It had started, as so many things did in Hartwell in 1882, with a dead man. James Brenner had been brought into town on a wagon board on a cold Monday morning in late March, his body already 2 days stiff, found by his own wife at the bottom of the dry creek bed half a mile north of their homestead. The official explanation, delivered by Dr. Horace Vane without much ceremony, was that James had fallen from his horse, struck his head on the creek stones, and died from the blow. It was the kind of explanation that answered the question just well enough to prevent the next one from being asked. Wallace had stood over that body in the back room of Doc Vane's surgery and felt the particular unease he had learned, over 7 years of wearing a badge in the territory, to take seriously. The bruising on James Brenner's temple was wrong. Not wrong like a fall, wrong like a strike. But Doc Vane had written down what he wrote down, and Wallace had no witnesses and no evidence and no real reason, on the surface of it, to push. The widow had come in to identify the body on that same cold Monday morning. Wallace had seen her through the window of the surgery before she came in, a woman of perhaps 30 years, dark-haired, straight-backed, wearing a coat that had been mended at both elbows. She walked across the frozen mud of the side street like she was carrying something enormous and simply refused to set it down. There was no theater in her grief. She went in, she looked at her husband, she said yes, that's James, and she came back out. Wallace had been standing on the step when she emerged. He had introduced himself. She had shaken his hand with a grip that surprised him, firm and dry and direct, and she had looked at him with gray eyes that were clear in a way that struck him as remarkable given what she had just done on the other side of that door. "I am Florence Brenner," she had said. "My husband had a homestead claim at the North Fork of the Cimarron. It is a valid claim, filed in 1874. I intend to keep it." Wallace had said that he had no reason to think otherwise. She had nodded, thanked him, and walked back to where her wagon was tied. He had watched her go and thought that was a woman who had been preparing herself to fight something before she even knew what shape it would take. He had been right. The second time he saw her was 2 weeks later when she came into his office with a letter. The letter was from a firm of land attorneys in Santa Fe, informing her that a dispute had been filed against the title of her homestead by the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company, and that she had 30 days to produce documentation supporting her claim or vacate the property. Wallace had read the letter carefully. "Who sent you this?" "A writer from Santa Fe." He did not wait for a response. "Have you got the original deed?" "I have the original deed, the survey plats from 1874, the water rights filing from 1876, and every tax receipt since the claim was registered." She paused. "My husband was not a careless man." "No," Wallace agreed. "He doesn't sound like he was." He looked at her across his desk. She was wearing a different coat today, dark wool, no visible mending, and her dark hair was pulled back neatly, and she had the same clarity in those gray eyes that he had noticed at the surgery. He found himself wanting to hold that gaze a moment longer than was strictly necessary and looked back down at the letter instead. "This dispute filing is legal, Mrs. Brenner, which means it has to go through proper channels. But 30 days is 30 days. I would recommend you get those documents to an attorney in Hartwell immediately." "I went to Emmett Slade," she said. "He told me the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company is a client of his firm." Of course they were. "There is an attorney in Las Cruces named George Pryor. He is honest. I will write you a letter of introduction if you like." She accepted it without excessive gratitude, which he appreciated. She was not the kind of woman who made a performance of being helped. She took what was useful and moved forward. There was something about that quality, clean and direct, and without pretense, that Wallace had been turning over in his mind in the 3 weeks between her second and third visit. The third visit was the one that had culminated in Darby Crane's paper hitting his desk. Florence Brenner had arrived early that morning, before the town was properly awake, her horse dusty from a hard ride, with a thick envelope of documents, and a look on her face that he was beginning to recognize as her fighting face. She had spread the papers on his desk and walked him through them with the focused precision of a woman who had spent the previous 3 weeks doing nothing, but preparing for exactly this moment. "The Sentinel Creek Cattle Company," she said, "purchased the original survey rights to the eastern section of the Cimarron Valley in 1879. My homestead is not on the eastern section. It is on the North Fork, which was surveyed separately in 1873 as a distinct parcel. But they have filed with the Territorial Land Commissioner claiming that the 1879 purchase includes the North Fork parcel, which it does not. The boundary line in their own deed stops at Ridgecroft Bluff. My land is a 1/4 mile north of Ridgecroft Bluff." Wallace had leaned over the maps. She was right. Unambiguously, clearly, provably right. "Then why is the land commissioner entertaining their claim?" he had asked. "Because," she said, and there was a controlled bitterness in the word, Sentinel Creek's principal owner is a man named Marcus Aldgate, who made a substantial donation to the governor's re-election campaign last year, and the land commissioner serves at the governor's pleasure. Where did you learn all this? George Pryor in Las Cruces. He is an honest man, as you said. He is also frightened. He told me what he knew and then told me he could not represent me publicly without losing his license. Wallace had straightened up and looked at her. The morning light through his office window caught the line of her jaw, the set of her shoulders, the absolute steadiness of her. He had felt something shift in his chest, quiet and serious, the way ground shifts before a spring. "So you came to me," he said. "You are the law here, Sheriff Rourke, and from what I have been told, you are the honest kind." "Who told you that?" "George Pryor," a pause. "And also my neighbor Hattie Drummond, who says you once rode 12 miles in a blizzard to return her husband's stray cattle." "Her husband owed me a poker debt. It was not entirely selfless." The corner of her mouth had moved then, just slightly, and it was not quite a smile, but it was the approach of one, and Wallace had felt it like a warmth. Then Darby Crane had arrived and thrown his paper, and Wallace had said what he'd said. And now he was riding north toward the Cimarron in the afternoon sun with a head full of legal complications and a heart full of something newer and less defined. The Brenner homestead was a quarter-mile north of Ridgecroft Bluff, exactly as Florence had described. It sat on a shallow rise above the creek with a good southern aspect, the house solid and well-made of adobe and timber, with a kitchen garden along the east wall that was newly turned for spring planting, and a barn that needed paint but was structurally sound. James Brenner had built well. Wallace dismounted at the gate and tied his horse and was halfway to the front door when it opened, and Florence came out onto the narrow porch with an expression that was half relief and half alarm. "What happened?" she asked immediately. "Darby Crane from the Territorial Land Office came to my office this afternoon with an eviction order signed by the land commissioner." Her face went very still. "And I declined to file it. I told him to bring me an honest order or get off my porch." The silence stretched between them in the afternoon air. A hawk turned slowly in the sky above the creek. Florence looked at Wallace for a long moment, and then she looked away toward the mountains in the west, and he could see her jaw working slightly as she absorbed what he had said and what it meant. "They will have you removed," she said. "If you stand against them, Marcus Aldgate will have you removed from your position." "He might try," Wallace said. "He would need a majority of the town council to do it, and I have a decent relationship with most of them. But that is not why I came." He climbed the 2 porch steps and stood near enough that he could speak quietly. "I came because I think we have a narrow window to get ahead of this, and I want to help you use it. I know a federal circuit judge named Abel Marsh who will be in Albuquerque at the end of the month. If we can get your documentation in front of him before Aldgate can arrange a friendly hearing at the territorial level, you have a real chance." Florence studied him. The afternoon light was full on her face now, and he could see the fine lines of exhaustion around her eyes, the slight hollowness of someone who had not been sleeping well, and underneath all of it the same unbreakable clarity that had struck him on that cold Monday morning at the surgery. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question was direct, not suspicious, but genuinely asking. Wallace took a moment before answering. He had been asking himself the same question on the ride up here and had arrived at several answers, some professional and some considerably less so. He went with the professional one first. "Because the eviction order is fraudulent, and filing a fraudulent legal instrument against a legitimate homestead claim is not something I am willing to be part of. That is my job." "And the other reason?" she asked, because apparently she had heard the end. He met her eyes. "'Cause your husband was brought into town on a wagon board with a wound on his head that a fall from a horse does not make, and I have been uneasy about that since March. And the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company beginning to move on your land 3 weeks after his death is a coincidence I find very difficult to accept." The color left her face, not all at once, but in stages, like the sun going behind a cloud. "You think they killed him," she said. It was not a question. "I think it is possible." I think if they wanted this land badly enough to corrupt a territorial official, they wanted it badly enough to remove an obstacle. He kept his voice steady. I'm not saying this to frighten you, Mrs. Brenner. I am saying it because you deserve to know what I think and because knowing it changes how carefully we need to move. Florence was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, in a voice that was low and absolutely level, I have thought that since the morning I found him. I have been saying it in my head since March. No one I have spoken to would hear it. I hear it, Wallace said. She looked at him then with something in her eyes that was not the clear fighting clarity of before, but something softer and more complicated, something that a person wore when they had been carrying a secret fear alone for too long, and someone had finally said, I hear it, and meant it. Come inside, she said. I have the documents organized. I will show you everything. The kitchen was warm and clean and smelled of coffee and something baking, and Florence set out the documents on the kitchen table with the same systematic precision he had seen in his office. Except now, he was watching her move through her own space, her own home, and that was different from watching her across a desk. She moved with an efficiency that was also a kind of ease, the particular comfort of a person in a place they have built and know deeply. And Wallace sat at the table and watched her, and felt the thing in his chest that had shifted that morning settle into something more definite. She was not a small woman, not in height, which was medium, but in presence. She occupied a room directly, without apology, without the diffidence he had seen in women who had spent too long being spoken over. She had opinions and she expressed them. She had information and she organized it. She looked at him when she talked to him, straight and clear, and she listened to him the same way, with her full attention. He had known a good many people in his 34 years, and Florence Brenner was among the most genuinely present of them. They worked through the evening. She had, as she had told him, every document in order: deeds, surveys, water rights, tax receipts, boundary certificates. She also had something else, which she produced from a locked tin box kept in the back of a kitchen cabinet. It was James Brenner's journal, kept in a small brown leather book with a clasp, and the last 3 months of entries described, in careful and specific language, 3 visits from agents of the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company offering to buy the Brenner homestead, each offer more aggressive than the last, and James Brenner's repeated refusals, and his growing unease about the way the men conducting these visits spoke. Not like buyers, he had written, but like men telling you the price of something that is already sold. The last entry was dated 4 days before James Brenner was found at the bottom of the creek. Wallace read it twice. Then he looked up at Florence, who was watching him from across the table, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He knew, Wallace said. Yes, she said. He knew someone was going to come for the land, he just did not think they would come for him. May I take this journal? Not permanently. I will copy the relevant entries and return it. Yes, she paused. Be careful with it. It is all I have of him that is not. She stopped. Not from weakness, but from the particular discipline of a woman who knew her own grief and managed it with deliberate care. It is all I have of his voice, she finished. I will treat it accordingly, Wallace said, and he meant it in a way that had weight beyond the practical. He rode back to Hartwell in the dark, the journal in his saddlebag and a plan forming in his head. He had 3 pieces of what he needed. The documentation that proved Florence's claim was legitimate, the journal that suggested a motive for murder, and the fraudulent eviction order that suggested the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company was moving fast, which meant they were either confident or frightened. He needed to find out which. In the morning he sent 2 telegrams. One went to Judge Abel Marsh in Albuquerque, requesting an emergency hearing on a fraudulent land claim. One went to a former colleague in Santa Fe named Henry Keats, who was a reporter for the Territorial Gazette and one of the only journalists in New Mexico who had not been quietly purchased by one interest or another. Then he went to see the town council. The Hartwell Town Council met in the back room of the bank on Thursday mornings, which happened to be the following day, and Wallace arrived early and told them plainly what was happening. There were 5 council members. 3 of them were small business owners who had nothing to gain from Sentinel Creek's expansion into the valley and several things to lose. One was a rancher named Abe Coulter, who Wallace suspected had been approached by Sentinel Creek as well. The 5th was a thin, watchful man named Prescott who ran the freight office and whose loyalties Wallace had never entirely pinned down. He laid out the situation without drama: a legitimate homestead claim, a fraudulent territorial order, a corrupt land commissioner, and his refusal to execute the order. "You understand," said the rancher Abe Coulter quietly, "that if Aldgate's people push, they could apply to the county sheriff in Dorado to execute the order instead." "They could," Wallace agreed. "If they want to do this slow and loud, and in front of a federal judge who I intend to have looking at it by the end of the month," Prescott at the freight office said, "you're making an enemy of a very powerful man, Sheriff." "I'm doing my job," Wallace said. "The question is whether this council backs the law or backs Marcus Aldgate." 3 of them backed the law without hesitation. Prescott was quiet for a long moment and then said he would not vote to remove Wallace from his position over this. Abe Coulter said the same. It was not a declaration of war, but it was ground to stand on. Henry Keats arrived from Santa Fe 4 days later, riding a rented horse and carrying a notebook that was already half full of other stories. He was a compact, energetic man of 40 with ink-stained fingers and a sharp professional mind, and he listened to Wallace's summary and then asked 9 very specific questions, and then he asked if he could speak to Florence Brenner. Wallace rode him out to the homestead the following afternoon. He was aware, in a way that had nothing to do with newspapers or legal strategy, of his own reaction to going back to the homestead. He had been back twice since that first evening, both times with practical purposes: once to collect additional documentation, once to bring Florence a copy of the telegram he had sent to Judge Marsh. Each time he had been conscious of something that was not quite tension, but was in the same family, a kind of heightened attentiveness, an awareness of the distance between himself and Florence that had begun, in small and quiet ways, to feel like a thing he wanted to reduce. He had not acted on any of this. It had been 6 weeks since James Brenner's death. Florence was in the middle of a legal battle for her home. He was a sheriff with uncertain professional footing. There was no appropriate moment for anything other than what they were doing, which was work. But work, it turned out, could be done in a kitchen at a table with coffee and lamplight, and a woman who looked at you with gray eyes that had begun, over the previous 2 weeks, to hold something besides fighting clarity when they rested on your face. He noticed. He did not pretend he didn't, but he also said nothing. Henry Keats interviewed Florence for 2 hours, and she answered his questions with the same organized directness she brought to everything. She showed him the documents. She showed him the journal. She spoke about James with a restraint and dignity that Wallace could see visibly affected Keats, who was not a sentimental man but who was a fair one. When it was over and Keats stepped outside to water his horse, Florence stood at the kitchen window and said, without looking at Wallace, "He will print it. He will print it if it holds up, and it holds up. And that will help. It will make it harder for Aldgate to proceed quietly. Corruption needs quiet to work. Print makes noise." She turned from the window and looked at him. "You have done a great deal," she said. "You have put yourself at real risk for this. My position, possibly, nothing else." "Your position is your livelihood, Sheriff Rourke. That is not nothing." "No," he agreed, "but it's not your home." There was a pause, and something in the quality of the silence between them changed. It was the same kitchen, the same lamp, the same window with the same darkening sky behind it, but the feeling in the room had shifted half a degree, the way a compass needle shifts when you bring it close to iron, and Wallace felt the shift all the way through him. Florence looked at him steadily. "I would like to call you Wallace if that's acceptable." "I wish you would," he said, "and I will call you Florence if you'll allow it." "I've been allowing it in my head for 2 weeks," she said, and there was the near smile again, that approach to warmth that was more affecting than a full smile would have been, and Wallace felt the compass needle swing further and hold. He said goodnight before he said anything that would complicate things, rode back to Hartwell with Keats, and spent the night sitting up with James Brenner's journal, copying the relevant entries into his own case notes. Not because he hadn't already copied them, but because it gave him something to do with his hands while his mind kept circling back to the kitchen window and the gray eyes turning from it to find him. The article in the Territorial Gazette ran 10 days later. Henry Keats had written it precisely and without embellishment, presenting the documented evidence of the boundary dispute, the fraudulent land commissioner's order, and a careful summary of the circumstances surrounding James Brenner's death. He had not accused Marcus Aldgate of murder directly, because a careful journalist did not accuse without proof, but he had laid the timeline with such specificity that the reader was left to draw conclusions with very little assistance. The response was immediate and loud. Aldgate's people filed a formal complaint against Wallace with the county authorities in Dorado, alleging that he had exceeded his jurisdiction and interfered with a lawful territorial process. The county sheriff, a man named Pete Driscoll, who Wallace had a professional acquaintance with and not much else, sent a letter saying he had received the complaint and would need to conduct an inquiry. Marcus Aldgate himself appeared in Hartwell. Wallace had expected someone theatrical. What he got was a man of 60, not large, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of undemonstrative physical stillness that very powerful men sometimes had, men who had not needed to gesture or threaten for so long that they had simply stopped. Aldgate came alone, which was its own kind of statement, and he walked into Wallace's office on a Tuesday morning and sat down across the desk without being invited. "Sheriff Rourke," he said, "I thought it was time we spoke directly." "I've been waiting," Wallace said. Aldgate looked around the office with mild interest as if cataloging it. "I don't want trouble here. I want a piece of land that by any reasonable reading of the 1879 surveys belongs within the boundary of my purchase." "The 1879 surveys put your boundary at Ridgecroft Bluff," Wallace said. "The Brenner parcel is north of the bluff. That is not a reasonable reading, Mr. Aldgate. That is a misreading. Survey boundaries in this territory are frequently imprecise. James Brenner's original survey from 1874 is not imprecise. Neither is the water rights filing from 1876. Neither is the boundary certificate from the territorial office that same year. All three place the North Fork parcel clearly outside your 1879 purchase." Aldgate was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Brenner," he said, "is a widow alone on a homestead that is not suited to profitable farming. She would be well served by a fair purchase price. I am prepared to be very generous. She doesn't want to sell. She has said so through 3 separate visits from your agents, and her late husband said the same in writing." Wallace leaned forward slightly. "You need to understand something, Mr. Aldgate. I sent a federal circuit judge the documentation for this case 11 days ago. I expect a hearing date within the month. If you move against that homestead before a federal ruling, I will have grounds for contempt proceedings, and I will use them." The silver-haired man looked at Wallace without any expression at all. Then he said quietly, "You are a very stubborn man." "I've been called worse." Aldgate stood. "I hope for your sake that you are right about the judge, because if you are wrong, your position here becomes very uncomfortable." He picked up his hat, "and Mrs. Brenner's situation becomes very precarious." "Is that a threat, Mr. Aldgate?" "It is an observation." He walked to the door. "Good day, Sheriff." Wallace held himself very still until the man had gone and then let out a long breath and pressed both hands flat on the desk. His heart was steady, which was something he had always been grateful for in moments like this, not recklessness, just steadiness, the ability to sit inside a threat and not let it move him when moving would have been wrong. He rode to the homestead that evening. He told himself it was to update Florence on Aldgate's visit. That was true. It was also not the only thing that was true. Florence was in the kitchen garden when he arrived, kneeling in the turned earth in the long light of the evening, setting out seedlings in the careful, practiced way of someone who had been doing it for years. She looked up when she heard his horse and rose to her feet, dusting her hands on her apron, and walked to the gate to meet him. He told her about Aldgate's visit. She listened without interruption, and he watched her face cycle through something: calculation, anger, fear briefly touched and then set aside, and finally something that resolved into determination. "He will not stop," she said. "No, but stopping him is not what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get ahead of him before a judge who cannot be bought, and I think I'm going to manage it. And if you don't—" "I will manage it," he said, and he said it not with the false brightness of false comfort but with the plain conviction of a person who had looked at the evidence and made an assessment. And Florence heard the difference, because she always heard the difference, and some of the tension went out of her shoulders. She said, "Have you eaten?" "Not since midday." "Then come in," she said. "I made too much stew." He came in, and they ate, and the conversation moved from the legal situation to other things, the way it had begun to do over the previous weeks. Florence talked about the kitchen garden, about the spring planting she was planning, about the 2 horses in the barn and the small flock of chickens that had survived the winter. She talked about James, not with grief's full weight but with the natural reference of someone whose life had been shared. James had planted the apple seedling on the west side of the house. James had preferred his coffee without sugar. James had been a man who talked to his horses. Wallace listened. He was good at listening. And he offered himself in return, not with great speeches but in the way he answered her questions, which were direct and curious, and treated him as an intelligent adult. He told her about the 7 years in Hartwell, the previous 5 in Las Cruces before that. He told her about growing up in Tennessee before the war, before everything changed. He did not tell her about the war itself, and she did not ask, because she had the sensitivity to know that some things were offered only in their own time. What he did tell her, over the second cup of coffee in the warm kitchen with the lamp burning low between them, was this: "I have not sat at a table and talked to another person like this in a long time." She was quiet a moment. "Neither have I," she said. Then carefully, "Though I am aware that my situation makes me, that there are people who would say my judgment is compromised by recent events." "Your judgment," Wallace said, "has been the clearest and most reliable thing I have encountered in 6 weeks of a complicated situation." She looked at him, and the gray eyes held something that was entirely open for just a moment, completely unguarded in a way she usually wasn't, and he felt it like a hand placed over his heart. "You are not a simple man to read," she said. "You are very contained." "I am working on being less so," he said, which was more honest than he had intended, and he could hear it in his own voice as it landed. And evidently she could too, because the near smile appeared, and this time it completed itself fully. And it was the first real full smile he had seen from her, and it was, he thought, entirely worth the wait. He rode back to Hartwell in the dark for the second time and sat up, not with journals but with himself, taking stock of where he was and what he wanted and what was possible. What he wanted was clear. It had been clear for at least a week, and probably longer in some form that he had been less willing to name. What was possible depended on things outside his control, principally a federal judge and a corrupt land commissioner, and a powerful man with reasons Wallace had not yet fully understood. What he had was a badge, a case file, and the knowledge that Florence Brenner was the kind of person he had not been expecting to find and could not now imagine not knowing. He went to sleep at 1 in the morning and was up at 5, and he rode out to the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company's main ranch house before breakfast. He had been there once before, a year ago, on a routine matter involving strayed stock. The ranch was large and well organized, with good fencing and a substantial main house, and a bunkhouse that held perhaps 40 hands. At this hour the place was already alive with morning work. Wallace tied his horse at the rail and asked to speak to the foreman. The foreman was a large, weathered man named Cal Rennick, who received him without warmth but without hostility. Wallace thanked him for his time and said he was trying to close out the formal inquiry into James Brenner's death, which the county required, and asked whether any of the Sentinel Creek hands had been in the Cimarron Valley on the day in question. Rennick said he didn't keep track of his men's private movements. Wallace said that was fair, and had Rennick himself been in the valley that week, and Rennick said he had not. Then Wallace showed him a sketch he had made from memory of the boot print he had found on the creek bank near where James Brenner had been found, a print he had not reported to anyone else yet, with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. He watched Rennick's face as he looked at the sketch and watched it show nothing at all, which was itself interesting, because a man who had genuinely no knowledge of the event would have shown something: curiosity, confusion, a question. Cal Rennick showed nothing, and that nothing told Wallace something he would file away and return to in time. He rode back to Hartwell and found a telegram waiting from Judge Abel Marsh. The judge would be in Albuquerque on the 22nd of May and would hear the Brenner land claim matter at 10 in the morning. He required all documentation, all parties, and pointedly, the presence of the Territorial Land Commissioner who had signed the fraudulent order. It was May 8th. They had 2 weeks. Wallace rode to the homestead and told Florence. She read the telegram standing at the kitchen counter and then set it down and put both palms flat on the counter and breathed for a moment. 2 weeks, she said. It is enough. Your documents are already organized. I will prepare a formal submission. We will go to Albuquerque on the 20th. She turned from the counter. Together. I will accompany you as a witness and as the officer who refused to execute the fraudulent order. My testimony will be part of the record. A pause. And because I am not willing to let you walk into that hearing room alone. Florence looked at him across the kitchen, and the something that had been building between them in the warm kitchen and the evening conversations, and the near smiles was now fully present in the room, no longer peripheral but central, and they both knew it. Wallace, she said, and his name in her voice had a particular quality, careful and warm at once. Florence, he said, and then he stopped, because there was something he needed to say and he was trying to say it in the right order, which was the practical facts first. The hearing will settle the land matter. After that, I intend to continue investigating James's death. I believe there is a case to be made, and I intend to make it, regardless of what Aldgate or the Territorial Office or anyone else says about it. I know, she said. You told me that weeks ago. I am telling you again because I want you to know it is not conditional on the hearing outcome. Whatever happens with the land, I am not dropping James. Her jaw tightened, and her eyes went bright for just a moment, and she looked away and then back. Thank you, she said, and it was the first time the words had come from her with that particular weight, genuine and unguarded. And after those things, Wallace said, after the hearing and after the investigation, I would very much like to take you to dinner in Hartwell, at the hotel dining room, which is not excellent but is the best available, and I would like to do it in a context that has nothing to do with legal documents. The pause that followed was perhaps 3 seconds long and felt considerably longer. Florence said, I would like that very much. Wallace nodded once, as if this had been a matter of business concluded to mutual satisfaction, and then he picked up his hat, which he had not entirely needed to put down in the first place, and he said he would be back on the 19th to travel together, and he walked out to his horse and mounted up and rode back down the track toward Hartwell, feeling lighter than he had in a very long time. The 2 weeks before the hearing were not quiet ones. The Sentinel Creek Cattle Company, apparently informed of the judge's date, accelerated their pressure. 2 of Florence's neighboring homesteaders received visits from Aldgate's agents offering to purchase their claims, which Wallace took as a signal that Aldgate was trying to establish a broader footprint in the valley before the hearing could narrow his options. One of those homesteaders, a German farmer named Gustav Hamel, came to Wallace's office in considerable distress. Wallace assured him that his claim was independent of Florence's, and that buying out his neighbors would not help Aldgate's case before a federal judge. And then he spent an afternoon helping Hamel locate his own original deed, which had been, it turned out, misfiled at the territorial office in a way that could charitably be called an error, and less charitably called something else. He also received a formal letter from the county sheriff in Dorado saying that the inquiry into Wallace's conduct was being held in abeyance pending the federal hearing outcome, which was less a vindication than a decision to wait and see how the wind blew. But it was enough. On the 17th of May, Cal Rennick left the Sentinel Creek Ranch. Wallace's deputy Tom Aldrich brought him that news, having heard it from the hand who was hired to replace Rennick within 24 hours of his departure. Rennick's forwarding address, according to the ranch's records, was listed as Texas. Wallace noted this and was aware of what it likely meant. A man who knows enough to run before the story fully breaks is a man who knows what the story contains. He sent a telegram to the Texas Rangers that evening with Rennick's description and the nature of his interest. He did not expect an immediate result, but he expected the net to tighten eventually. On the 19th of May, he rode to the Brenner homestead and found Florence already packed for the journey, a single travel bag beside the door and the horses watered and ready. She had arranged for Hattie Drummond to look after the place while she was gone, and she was wearing a dark blue dress that he had not seen before, neatly made with small buttons at the collar, and her dark hair was up in a way that was more formal than her usual workday arrangement. And she looked, Wallace thought privately, like the most quietly remarkable person he had ever met. They rode to the nearest rail stop at Cimarron Station and took the southbound train to Albuquerque. The journey was 4 hours, and they sat across from each other in the passenger car and talked for most of it, the conversation ranging from James's journal, which Wallace had fully copied into his case file, to Florence's background. She had grown up in Missouri, had come west with James in 1873, had found the land and loved it from the first sight of the Cimarron Valley in autumn, had never once in 9 years of hardship wished herself back east. "You are not afraid of hard things," Wallace said. "I am afraid of plenty of things," she said. "I am just not willing to let fear run the decisions. That is the same result." "It is not the same thing," she said with conviction. He thought about that. "No," he agreed. "You're right, it isn't." She leaned slightly forward in her seat. "What are you afraid of?" It was the kind of question he might have deflected with another person. He did not deflect it with Florence. "Failing people who depend on me," he said. "Being wrong about something that matters enough that being wrong costs someone something they can't get back." She looked at him steadily. "You did not fail me," she said. "Whatever happens in that courtroom tomorrow." "The hearing isn't over yet," he said. "No, but you came to that homestead when you didn't have to. You refused to file that order. You telegraphed a judge. You rode to Sentinel Creek. You have done all of that and the hearing hasn't happened yet." She held his gaze. "You do not fail people, Wallace. You worry about it the way good people do, but you do not fail them." He held that for a moment, the specific kindness of it, the way she had given it to him without ceremony, as a plain and honest assessment. "Thank you," he said. She gave him the full smile again, warm and direct and entirely hers. They arrived in Albuquerque in the early evening and checked into the Territorial Hotel on Gold Avenue, separate rooms on the same floor, the city loud and layered around them after the quiet of the Cimarron Valley. They ate dinner in the hotel dining room, which was considerably better than the Hartwell equivalent, with white tablecloths and a printed menu, and they talked and ate and drank a single glass of wine each, and the evening had the quality of something that was not quite a celebration, and not quite a working dinner, but was somehow both and something else as well. The particular warmth of two people who have been through something difficult together, and are now sitting in a moment of relative quiet. Discovering that they would choose to be here anyway, Wallace walked her to her room door. They stood in the corridor for a moment in the lamplight. "Sleep well," he said. "You as well." She looked up at him, and there was something in her face that was very open and direct and perhaps a question. "Wallace, when this is over, all of this, I want to show you the valley in summer. There is a stretch of the Cimarron above the North Fork where the cottonwoods come in, and it It is one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. I want to show it to you. I will hold you to that," he said. "Good," she said, and went into her room, and Wallace stood in the corridor a moment longer before going to his own, and he was smiling, which was something he did not do often enough and which felt, tonight, entirely natural. The hearing on the morning of the 22nd of May lasted 3 hours. Judge Abel Marsh was a spare, white-haired man of perhaps 65 who had been on the federal circuit for 20 years and had heard every variety of land fraud the territory could produce, and he had the manner of someone who was constitutionally immune to pretension. He read documents, he asked questions, and he had no visible patience for either delay or theater. The Territorial Land Commissioner, a man named Silas Hartner, appeared with an attorney from Santa Fe, and a set of arguments that Wallace had anticipated and that crumbled under Judge Marsh's questioning in roughly 45 minutes. The core of Hartner's position was that the 1879 Sentinel Creek Purchase, properly construed, incorporated all parcels contiguous to the eastern section of the valley, which did not withstand contact with Florence's documentation for more than 3 questions. Florence testified for 40 minutes. She was clear, organized, and entirely unintimidated by the formal proceedings, and Wallace, watching from the gallery seats, felt the particular pride of someone who has believed in a person's capabilities and been proven exactly right. Wallace testified for 20 minutes, presenting the fraudulent order and his grounds for refusing to execute it, and Judge Marsh listened with complete attention and wrote several things down. After a recess of 30 minutes, Judge Marsh returned and ruled. The Brenner homestead at the North Fork of the Cimarron Creek was the legal property of Florence Brenner, widow of James Brenner, the boundary established by the 1874 deed and confirmed by all subsequent filings. The 1879 Sentinel Creek Cattle Company purchase did not incorporate the North Fork parcel and had no legal claim to it. The eviction order filed by the Territorial Land Commissioner was ruled invalid and expunged from the record. Commissioner Hartner was referred to the Territorial Attorney General for a review of his conduct. The gallery was not crowded, but what few people were there made sound enough when the ruling came, and Florence sat very still for a moment and then covered her face with both hands briefly, just briefly, and then looked up and across the room and found Wallace, and the look on her face was not triumph but relief, the specific deep release of a person who has been carrying a terrible weight for a long time and has just been allowed to set it down. He was at her side within seconds. He did not think about whether it was appropriate. He was simply there, and she took his arm with both her hands and held it and said nothing, and he put his other hand over hers, and they stood like that in the emptying hearing room while the formal business concluded around them. "It's done," he said quietly. "It's done," she agreed, in a voice that was not quite steady and was all the more real for it. They celebrated at a restaurant on Central Avenue with the best meal Albuquerque had to offer, and Florence had 2 glasses of wine this time and Wallace had 1, and they talked and laughed, and she told him a story about James trying to teach her to rope cattle in their first year on the homestead that was genuinely funny, and he told her about the most embarrassing arrest he had ever made, which involved a circus bear and the blacksmith's shop, and the evening was warm and long and full. When he walked her to her room door this time, they both stopped in the corridor, and the pause between them was different from the previous night's, longer, more charged, with the particular quality of 2 people who have arrived at the same moment from the same direction and both know it. "Florence," he said. "I know," she said, and then, I do not want to rush past something that deserves not to be rushed." "I don't want that either," he said. "I want to do this right." "What does right look like to you?" He thought about it seriously. "Dinner in Hartwell, as I said, the summer along the Cimarron time." "That sounds," she said, "exactly like what I would choose." "We are agreed," he said. "We are agreed," she said, and she was smiling, full and warm and entirely aimed at him, and he leaned down and pressed a kiss to her forehead, which was not the entirety of what he wanted but was precisely what the moment called for, and she closed her eyes for just a second as it happened and then opened them. "Good night, Wallace. Good night, Florence." He walked down the corridor to his room, feeling the warmth of that moment like sunlight through glass, steady and clear and real. They took the northbound train home the following morning, and the valley received them back in the full brightness of a late May day, the Cimarron running clear and fast with snowmelt, the cottonwoods coming into their first summer green, the air smelling of sage and moving water. Wallace rode Florence to her gate and helped her down from her horse, and they stood in the afternoon with the homestead behind her and the mountains above it and the whole broad sky of New Mexico territory overhead. "The investigation," she said. "James, I have not forgotten. I know. I just wanted to say whatever you find or don't find, I want him to have justice. But I also want to go on living, Wallace." He would have wanted that. James was not a man who wanted anyone to stand still. "I know," Wallace said, "and the investigation and going on living are not mutually exclusive." "No," she said, "they are not." She reached up and put her hand against his jaw briefly, a touch that was light and deliberate and full of intention. "Come back soon." "Tomorrow," he said. She laughed, surprised, and it was the best sound he had heard in recent memory. He rode back to Hartwell and found a telegram from the Texas Rangers waiting on his desk. Cal Rennick had been found in Abilene. He had, when presented with the circumstantial evidence of his departure timing and the boot print sketch, made certain admissions in exchange for a lesser charge. The admissions implicated a man named Drew Holt, who had worked for the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company as what was described as a special contractor, and it implicated someone who had given Holt the order, which Rennick named as the company's operations manager, a man named Porter Graves. Wallace sent the Rangers telegram and his full case file to the federal prosecutor's office in Santa Fe the same evening. He also sent a copy to Henry Keats at the Territorial Gazette. Marcus Aldgate was not directly named in the admissions, which was either because Graves had operated without explicit instruction from the top, or because Rennick had not been close enough to the top to know. It was, from a prosecutorial standpoint, an imperfect result. But it was enough to bring formal charges against Graves and Holt, and it was enough that Marcus Aldgate would know, in the way that powerful men always know, that the walls had moved. Drew Holt was arrested in Las Cruces in late June, and Porter Graves was arrested the following week on the Sentinel Creek Ranch itself, taken away in irons while 30 ranch hands watched in silence. It was not the tidy resolution that would have come from an admission all the way to the top, and justice for James Brenner was partial in the way that justice in the territory sometimes was real but not complete. But 2 men who had participated in his death were facing federal charges, and the events were a matter of public record, and Florence knew. Wallace told her in person. He came to the homestead on a Tuesday evening in late June and sat at the kitchen table and laid out everything: Rennick's admissions, the arrests, what was provable and what was not. She listened to all of it without interrupting, and when he finished she was very still for a long moment. Then she said, "It's enough. It's not everything, but it's enough." "I'm sorry it's not everything," Wallace said. "So am I," she said. "But you promised me honest, not perfect, and this is honest." She looked at him across the table and her eyes were wet but controlled, the kind of tears that come from genuine feeling and don't need an apology. James deserved better than what happened to him. He gets some justice. That is not nothing. "It's not nothing," Wallace agreed. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his hand and held hers, and they sat like that in the warm kitchen for a while without saying anything, which was, he thought, one of the most comforting moments he had ever known. They had dinner in Hartwell's hotel dining room on the first Saturday of July, and it was exactly as he had promised, not an excellent establishment, but the best available, and Florence wore the dark blue dress and her hair up, and she was beautiful in the lamplight in a way that had nothing to do with appearance only and everything to do with who she was, the whole assembled person of her. The intelligence and directness and warmth, and the particular courage she carried so quietly that only someone paying close attention would know how much it cost. They talked all evening. They walked after dinner in the summer dark down Hartwell's Main Street, the town quiet around them, and Florence took his arm without being invited, and he covered her hand with his, and they walked the full length of the street and back and stood at the end of it looking up at a sky so thick with stars that it seemed close enough to touch. "I want to say something," Wallace said. "Then say it," Florence said, the way she always said things, direct and without fuss. "I have been thinking since March about what I want. Not what is practical or what is possible or what the correct timing is, although all of those things matter to me and I am not dismissing any of them, but what I want." He looked at her under the stars, her face tilted up toward him, perfectly still and entirely present. "I want this, you, whatever form it takes and however long it takes to take shape. I want to know you for the rest of my life, Florence Brenner." The pause was the kind that fills rather than empties. "Wallace Rourke," she said, "I want exactly the same thing." He kissed her then, not on the forehead this time but properly, with the full intention of it, standing on the main street of Hartwell under the July stars, and she kissed him back with the same straightforward completeness she brought to everything, no ceremony and no games, just the two of them being exactly honest about what they were. The summer passed in the particular richness of a season in which everything seems to arrive at once. They spent time at the homestead and time in town. He learned the rhythms of her days, the early rising, the garden, the horses, the practical work of the homestead that she managed with a competence that still impressed him regularly. The evenings when the day's work was done, and she would sit on the porch with a book, or simply watch the sky change color over the mountains. She showed him the cottonwoods stretch above the North Fork in August, as she had promised, and it was everything she had described and more. The trees enormous and white-barked and trembling with their silver leaves, the creek below running shallow and clear over polished stones, the whole valley lit from the west by afternoon light that turned everything gold. They sat on the bank and she leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they stayed there for a long time in the beautiful quiet of it. "James found this place," she said. "I want you to know that. He is part of what makes it what it is." "I know," Wallace said. "I'm not trying to take his place. I don't think that's what this is." "No," she agreed. "This is its own thing, new and its own." She turned to look at him. "I'm glad you refused that order." He laughed softly. "That is a low bar." "You know what I mean." "I do," he said. "I'm glad too." She reached up and kissed him, the cottonwoods shivering overhead, the creek speaking its steady language below them, and Wallace held her in the sunlight and was, in the full and honest sense of the word, happy. He proposed to her in September. He had bought the ring from the jeweler in Las Cruces on a trip he had taken specifically for the purpose, a modest band with a small garnet stone that was, he thought, more her style than the elaborate settings that sat in the front of the case. He had brought it back to Hartwell in his coat pocket, and carried it there for 3 weeks while he waited for the right moment. And the right moment arrived on a Sunday afternoon at the homestead, when they had been sitting on the porch after dinner in the cool September air, and the conversation had found one of its natural resting places, and Florence was looking out at the mountains with that expression she got when she was fully at peace with where she was. He took the ring from his pocket and held it out. She looked at it and then at him, and then she said, "Yes," without waiting for the question, because she knew him well enough by then to know what was coming, and because Florence Brenner had never needed elaborate preamble to reach a clear decision. "You didn't let me ask," he said. "Ask then," she said, already putting the ring on. "Will you marry me?" "I already said yes," she pointed out, looking at the ring on her hand with the near smile becoming the full smile. "You are impossible," he said. "You love it," she said. He did. He absolutely did. They were married in the small church on Hartwell's western edge on the first Saturday of November, 1882. The church was not full, but it was warmly attended. Hattie Drummond from the neighboring farm, and her husband Ed, and Gustave Hamel and his wife Marta, and Tom Aldrich his deputy, and the 3 town council members who had backed the law, and Henry Keats who had come from Santa Fe specifically for the occasion, and who was visibly moved in the practiced way of a journalist who encounters a good story and recognizes it. Florence wore a dress she had made herself over the previous 6 weeks, ivory cotton with small pearl buttons at the collar, very simple and very beautiful, and she walked down the aisle of the small church with Ed Drummond on her arm because she had asked him to do the honor, and she was the most composed bride Wallace had ever seen at a wedding, which was to say entirely present and entirely herself, not performing anything, simply there, simply true. He took her hands at the altar and looked at her and thought for a moment of March and the surgery door, and the first moment he had seen her, the straight spine and the mended coat and the grip like a person who was not going to let go, and how none of the months since had dimmed or complicated that first impression but had only deepened it, layer by layer, into something he trusted absolutely. He said his vows steadily and meant every word. She said hers the same way. And when she got to the part about taking this man for the rest of her life, she looked at him with the clear gray eyes that had always seen him plainly, and he felt, in the best and oldest sense, known. The celebration afterward was held in the hotel dining room, which Mrs. Kowalski, the proprietress, had outdone herself preparing, with a long table and good food, and a fiddler from the livery stable who turned out to have unexpected talent. And Florence danced with him in the cleared space near the window, while the town of Hartwell, in its small and genuine way, celebrated 2 of its own. They spent the wedding night at the hotel and moved the following week into a practical arrangement. Wallace transferred the bulk of his household to the homestead, keeping a room at the boarding house in town for the nights when duty required him to stay, and they settled into the particular pleasure of building a shared life from 2 independent ones. It was not without friction. Florence was accustomed to running her days according to her own decisions, and Wallace was accustomed to the deep solitude of a man who had lived alone for years, and there were moments of adjustment, moments of collision between preferences and habits, moments where each had to learn the other's way of being and decide where to move and where to stand. But they had both been forged in difficult circumstances, and they argued honestly and listened genuinely and came back to each other without the injury that comes from pride, and the life they built was stronger for being tested. In the spring of 1883, Marcus Aldgate, facing the referral of his land commissioner to the Attorney General, the federal charges against his operations manager and contractor, and the continued attention of Henry Keats's newspaper, sold the Sentinel Creek Cattle Company to an Eastern investor and left the territory for Colorado. It was not justice of the most satisfying variety, but it was, as Florence observed, a departure. Wallace closed the Brenner case file. He wrote the word "closed" on the front cover in his careful hand and put it in the archive cabinet, and said a private and brief word for James Brenner, who had built good and kept faith and deserved better than what he'd gotten, and had left behind a woman who had done him proud by every measure. In June of 1883, Florence told Wallace she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen after supper on a Thursday, plainly and directly, as she told him everything, and he went still for a moment in the way he went still when something mattered too much for an immediate response. Then he stood up and went to her and held her, and she laughed softly at the tightness of the embrace and put her arms around him and said, "You are going to need to breathe." "I am breathing," he said. "You are barely breathing," he breathed. "Are you well? How do you feel?" "Tired in the mornings. Fine the rest of the time. Strong." She leaned back to look at him, a little frightened if I'm honest. "So am I," he said, "but the same way you're frightened, not willing to let the fear run the decisions." She touched his face, exactly like that. Their son was born on the 23rd of February, 1884, in the homestead bedroom, delivered by Doc Vane from Hartwell with Hattie Drummond assisting, in the particular drama of a winter night with the snow coming down outside, and the kitchen stove burning high and the whole world reduced to that one room and the enormous, irreducible fact of new life arriving in it. Florence was remarkable through all of it, which surprised no one who knew her, and the baby boy arrived in the world red-faced and furious and loud, which seemed to Wallace entirely appropriate given his parentage. They named him James Wallace Rourke. Florence had suggested James. Wallace had not proposed it, not wanting to presume, but when she said it he felt the rightness of it at once, the continuity and the tribute, the way a name could honor what had been while belonging to what was new. Tom Aldrich held the baby the following morning and remarked that he had the Rourke look, which Wallace denied and Florence confirmed with a look of private amusement. Hattie Drummond, who had held more babies than any of them, declared him healthy and perfect, and held him for 20 minutes while Florence ate her first proper meal in 2 days, and Wallace sat beside her, and watched them both with the stunned, quiet fullness of a man who has been given more than he had known how to ask for. Life on the North Fork homestead settled into the particular richness of a family that knows how to work together, and has learned not to take its happiness for granted. The seasons turned summers along the Cimarron, autumns with the cottonwoods turning gold, winters close and warm in the adobe house, springs with the kitchen garden and the creek running high. Wallace continued to serve as sheriff of Hartwell, re-elected by the council in the fall of 1884 without opposition, and Florence continued to run the homestead with the systematic competence that had always defined her. Young James, who the Drummonds' grandchildren called Jimmy, and who Florence called James exclusively, until he was old enough to have opinions, was a bold and curious child who climbed everything climbable and asked more questions per day than Wallace had previously thought possible. He had Florence's gray eyes and Wallace's calm expression, and the particular combination produced a child who could assess a situation steadily, and then do something entirely unexpected with the information, which was, his parents agreed, both charming and exhausting. Wallace taught him to ride when he was 4. Florence taught him to read when he was 5, seated at the kitchen table with her systematic patience, and he was reading independently by 6, which made him the terror of the Hartwell schoolroom for being so far ahead of his classmates. In the spring of 1886, Florence told Wallace she was expecting again. This time she told him at the kitchen table over breakfast, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a familiar and welcome fact, and Wallace looked up from his coffee and smiled at her with the full, open smile he had developed over the years of their life together, the one she had once said she had been waiting half a year to see. When? November, I think. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. James was somewhere outside making sounds that suggested he was engaged in some project that would require later adult intervention, and the morning light was on the kitchen, and the mountains were clear through the window, and Wallace thought, as he thought fairly regularly, that life was unreasonably good. Their daughter was born on the 9th of November, 1886, a small, fierce creature with a set of opinions she expressed without hesitation from the first hour. They named her Clara Me Rourke, Clara for Wallace's mother and Me for Florence's sister who had stayed in Missouri. James regarded his sister with the seriousness of a 7-year-old confronting a new variable in a situation he had previously had under control. He spent 3 days being uncertain and then arrived at an opinion, which was that she was interesting, and from that point on was her most devoted protector, which Florence observed and Wallace recorded mentally as a quality he intended to encourage. The years moved in the way that good years do, not fast or slow but full. Wallace and Florence continued to be, in the private essential way of a marriage that has been built on honesty and grows from it, deeply in love, not in the breathless way of something new but in the solid and sustaining way of something that has been tested and held and continued to choose itself. They argued sometimes over real things and made it up without theater. They laughed regularly and often over small things and sometimes over the same things repeatedly, which is one of the underrated pleasures of knowing someone very well. Florence expanded the kitchen garden in 1887, adding a small orchard of apple and pear trees to the west side of the house, next to the tree James Brenner had planted in the first year of the homestead. She tended the original tree with the same care she gave the new ones, and in the fall of 1888, when it bore fruit for the first time since James had died, she made apple preserves and set a jar on the kitchen shelf and said nothing about what it represented, but Wallace knew, and she knew he knew, and that was enough. In the spring of 1889, New Mexico Territory was deep in conversations about statehood, and Wallace found himself increasingly occupied with the politics of it. The question of what kind of laws a state would have, whether the land rights and homestead protections that had been so hard-won in the territorial system would survive the transition, who would write the statutes, and whose interests they would serve. He attended meetings in Santa Fe and Albuquerque, and came home each time to the homestead and the children and Florence, who listened to everything he had seen and heard, and offered her analysis with the precision that he still, after 7 years, never stopped finding remarkable. "You should run for something," she said one evening in May of 1889, seated on the porch with the last of the day's light on the mountains. He looked at her. "What? State legislature when it comes. You have spent 7 years being honest in a position that did not financially reward honesty. The territory has noticed. The people who matter have noticed." She looked at him steadily. "You are good at the law, Wallace. Not just at executing it, but at thinking about it, about what it should be. You should be where those decisions are made." He was quiet for a moment. "It would mean travel, time away. I ran this homestead alone for years. I can manage with you in Santa Fe for sessions." "I haven't said yes. I know. I'm saying you should think about it seriously, rather than dismissing it because it feels like too much to want." He turned and looked at her with a feeling he had no word for precisely, which was something in the vicinity of being entirely and gratefully undone by her. "When did you start knowing me that well?" he asked. "Roughly March 1882, she said, and the full smile was there, warm and aimed at him, entirely familiar and entirely affecting. The same smile that had first arrived on a cold morning in his office and had been, over the 7 intervening years, the most reliably beautiful thing he knew. He thought about what she had said. He thought about it for 3 weeks, and then wrote a letter to the county committee expressing his interest in the legislative seat when statehood was secured, which was received with what could only be called enthusiasm. New Mexico would not achieve statehood for several more years, not until 1912 in the great arc of history, but the political conversations were serious and the groundwork was being laid, and Wallace Rourke's name was placed carefully and deliberately into the conversations being had by people who intended to do the thing right when the time came. In the autumn of 1889, the Brenner homestead received an unexpected visitor. He was a man of 60, well-dressed in gray, who rode up the track on a fine horse and asked at the gate for Mrs. Florence Rourke. Florence came to the door and recognized him after a moment as a man she had met once, years ago, in a lawyer's office in Las Cruces. He had been an associate of George Pryor's, a man named David Calloway. He brought news. George Pryor had died in August peacefully of old age. He had left a letter with Calloway, to be delivered to Florence Rourke when the time seemed appropriate, and the time, Calloway felt, had come. Florence opened the letter at the kitchen table with Wallace beside her, and James and Clara at the far end of the table doing their schoolwork, and she read it in silence, and then handed it to Wallace. George Pryor had written that he was sorry he had not been braver when Florence had come to him in 1882, that he had been a frightened man who let that fear guide him away from what was right, and that he had followed the case, and the outcome with a conscience that had been considerably improved by the result. He had included a formal notarized statement of everything he knew about Marcus Aldgate's land fraud operation, the conversations he had witnessed, the pressure applied to various officials, the names of the people involved. It was a document that arrived 7 years late and served a historical record more than an act of justice, but it closed something not for James Brenner, who was beyond earthly reckonings, but for Florence, who read it again after Wallace handed it back and sat with it for a moment in silence. "He was a frightened man who tried to do better," she said. "That is not nothing." "No," Wallace said. "It's not." She folded the letter carefully and put it in the tin box in the kitchen cabinet, next to James Brenner's journal, and went back to pouring the afternoon coffee. And Clara looked up from her schoolwork and asked what the letter was about. And Florence said it was old business that had been settled. And Clara accepted this with the pragmatism of an 8-year-old who had more pressing matters to attend to. Life continued in its richness. James grew into a tall, thoughtful boy who had his mother's organizational mind and his father's steady temperament, and who decided at 11 that he wanted to be a rancher, which pleased both his parents for different reasons. Clara grew into a small, electric girl with strong opinions, and a talent for mathematics that her Hartwell schoolteacher described as alarming, which Florence received as the compliment it was. Wallace and Florence walked the Cimarron Valley on Sunday afternoons when time allowed above the North Fork where the cottonwoods trembled in the summer wind, along the creek bank where the water ran clear over polished stones, up the ridge toward Ridgecroft Bluff, where on a clear day you could see 50 miles in every direction, and the whole vast landscape of New Mexico lay below you, mountains and desert and river valley, the great complicated beautiful fact of the place. They stood up there one Sunday in the fall of 1890, the two of them, with the valley laid out below and the October light turning everything amber and gold. And Wallace put his arm around Florence and she leaned into him, and they looked at what they had, not just the land, though the land was real and hard-won and deeply loved, but the life on it, the children in the house below, the years ahead of them. And Florence said, as she sometimes did when something was full and needed to be spoken, "I am very glad you refused that order." "I am very glad," Wallace said, "that I had something to refuse." She laughed softly and tilted her head up, and he kissed her in the October light on the ridge above the Cimarron, 8 years after a cold Monday morning at a surgery door, 7 years after a paper had hit his desk and changed both their lives, with the wind in the cottonwoods below them and the whole wide sky overhead and the homestead waiting. The land that Florence Brenner had fought to keep was still under her feet. The man she had not expected to find was beside her. The children they were raising together were below, young and bright and full of the future. The valley held all of it, as valleys do, the old things and the new, the grief and the joy, the hard years and the good ones, the names carved into its history and the living people who carried them forward. The Cimarron ran on. The cottonwoods turned and trembled. The mountains stood their ancient watch over the North Fork and the homestead and the lives built there. And Florence Rourke, who had been Florence Brenner on a cold morning in March 1882 when she walked into a surgeon's room and came out fighting, stood on the ridge with her husband in the October light and was entirely, fully, peacefully at home.